getting in the ambulance, getting to the hospital. Luckily, I had a great surgeon and I had so much pain medication at that point. I was kind of out of it.
Nobody has said no to more people than Simon Cowell. He has crushed thousands of dreams with a few words and a raised eyebrow. For 30 years, he has been the judge on the most watched talent shows on earth, the one nobody wanted to disappoint and everybody quietly feared. He built an empire worth hundreds of millions of pounds and turned strangers into the biggest acts on the planet. And then, in an interview that caught everyone off guard, the toughest man on television admitted something that changed the public picture of him. He said that for a period of his life, he did not care whether he lived or died. It's worth pausing on that. You have probably met someone who seemed untouchable, someone whose confidence looked so genuine that you assumed they had never had a painful moment. Then, one ordinary day, you found out that the certainty you admired was actually built to protect the softest, most frightened part of them. In a single sentence, that is Simon Cowell's story. A man who spent 60 years convincing the world he could not be hurt while being quietly broken in ways almost nobody was allowed to see. The public was only ever shown one version of him: the cruel judge, the cold businessman, the one who could reduce a teenager to tears and move on before the cameras stopped rolling. Nobody was shown the version he carried around in his chest for decades, the one nobody on the judging panel ever saw. A boy sent away to a school he hated. A young man mocked for having no talent, told he would never amount to anything. A music executive who almost lost everything so many times he stopped counting. A man who climbed to the top of the world and found it lonely. Then came the blows that hurt most. The two people who loved him, taken from him, a back broken in several places, and a hidden struggle with depression the cameras never saw and the public knew nothing about until he spoke. This isn't a story about the cold businessman you think you know. It's about the man who hid inside the businessman for 60 years and what happened when the mask finally started to crack. Before we reach the moment that cracked it open, it helps to understand who Simon Cowell was before the world handed him a microphone, a desk, and the power to say no to thousands of people. The man who built an empire on telling others they weren't good enough was, underneath it, a boy who had been told the same thing himself. That's the crack in the foundation everything else rests on. To understand why a man with every reason to celebrate spent years feeling he wanted to disappear, you have to go back to the start. To a comfortable house in the leafy suburbs of England, where a clever, difficult, quietly terrified boy was already learning the most important lesson of his life. Never let anyone see you hurt. Simon Philip Cowell was not born poor, hungry, or into struggle. He was born on the 7th of October 1959 in London and raised in Elstree, a quiet suburb of Hertfordshire best known for the film and television studios on its edge. His father, Eric, was a music industry executive and property developer, full of charm and energy. His mother, Julie, was a ballet dancer and socialite who met Eric while working at one of his properties. By every outward measure, it was a comfortable, loving, secure home. Money was never a problem. The holidays were always booked, and the family looked perfect from the outside. But Simon later said something that cuts a crack through that perfect picture. Of everything he was taught as a child, the most important lesson came from his father when Simon was 12. His father sat him down and told him that everyone in life has a sign over their head, and the sign says, "Make me feel important." A father teaching a son that the whole secret to connection is making other people feel valued. That deep down, the reason any of us does anything is to feel that we matter. Now consider the career that boy went on to build. It was built more than anything to tell other people they were not good enough. A man handed a map for kindness to someone who spent decades earning his fortune from the opposite of it. That irony sits at the center of his life. He was taught that making people feel important is what matters, and he built a worldwide career on making people feel small. The answer, as we'll see, is that the person he was really trying to convince of his own importance was himself. Underneath it all, Simon was shy. People who knew him early said he struggled for years with a small stutter he worked hard to hide, a detail he only revealed in his 60s, admitting almost nobody had known. He would trip over the smallest words in private, then stand before hundreds of millions of people and deliver one of the most feared verdicts on earth. He was sent to a boarding school in Dover that he hated so completely, he wrote a heartbreaking letter home, trying to make his parents feel guilty for sending him. He hated the rules, the authority, the conformity. He did not fit, and the boxes of a British boarding school tolerate a boy who won't fit. So he left as early as he could, at 16, with no real qualifications and no idea what he would do with his life. The most famous music judge in the world, at 16, had no direction, just a shy, bright kid who had learned one rule: never let anyone see you hurt. So he floated. He took a job as a runner at a studio nearby, then worked in the mailroom at EMI Music Publishing, sorting envelopes and running errands until he got bored and quit. He tried an estate agent's office and hated it more. He was drifting, a privileged kid with no plan. And there is a special cruelty in being 20 with the world open and feeling like you are already behind, already failing, already being judged. Then out of nowhere, EMI called him back and gave him a job in a different department, one that changed everything. There he met Pete Waterman, the record producer who became his mentor. Waterman looked at the hungry young man and saw something nobody else had: hunger, a willingness to work, and a nose for a hit that hadn't been sharpened yet. He taught Simon how the music business worked, how to listen, how to judge, how to pull a song apart until it was almost right, and how to spot the one person in 100 who truly had it. That relationship is where Simon's education really began, not in a classroom, but in the messy business of finding talent. Here's a question worth sitting with. What was the turning point in your life? A single person who saw something everyone else missed and gave you a chance. For Simon Cowell, that one person redirected his entire life. His whole story is about being seen and being judged, and the thing he feared most his whole life was not being good enough. For 2 decades, Simon Cowell did what you must do to survive the music business. He fought, clawed, failed, and got back up. He left EMI for a short partnership with a former colleague that failed. He formed Fanfare Records with Ian Burton, working from a tiny office, chasing hits that barely existed. There he found the young singer Sanita, signed her, and watched her climb the charts with So Macho, followed by Toy Boy, a song he asked his old mentor Pete Waterman to write. For a moment, the label looked like it would make it. Then, in 1989, Fanfare Records folded. Simon was broke, in debt, and 30 years old, standing in the rubble of a dream he had poured his energy into for years. For a less stubborn man, that would have been the end. But the hunger that kept him floating at 16 saved him again. He didn't quit. He went back to work, taking a job as an artist and repertoire consultant at BMG Records. And something clicked. Freed from the pressure of running a label, doing what he actually knew, finding songs and finding stars, he began to win. At BMG, he became one of the most effective hitmakers in Europe, finding a string of acts and a string of singles that kept the label alive and made his name. He had gone from the boy told he had no talent to the man who couldn't stop finding it in others. He did it by telling the truth, by being blunt, by saying what nobody else would say. A man who tells the truth is a threat, and one who tells it on television in front of millions is a phenomenon. In 2001, everything changed. He was asked to join the judging panel of a new show called Pop Idol, where ordinary people auditioned in front of the judges. The cameras turned on the blunt man, and the world could not look away. His straight, sometimes brutal comments became the reason people watched. A world trained to expect polite, sympathetic television fell in love with the one man who refused to be polite, the first person in years who said what everyone was thinking and nobody had the courage to. By 2002, the show crossed the Atlantic and became American Idol, making Simon the most famous judge on the planet. His partnership with Paula Abdul and Randy Jackson became the most watched judging panel in television history. Millions tuned in each week, less for the singers than for him, to see who he'd crush, who he'd save, and what one-liner he'd deliver that would end up on 1 million YouTube clips. He was the center of the biggest television phenomenon on Earth. And somewhere in that deafening success, the quiet, uncertain boy was buried deeper under a persona the world had made and he had learned to perform. The tough guy, the Iceman, the businessman who never softened. Everyone who clapped for that version of him was clapping for a mask. The mask wasn't fake. Simon really could be cold and brutal, and he really could say terrible things. That was real. But it wasn't all of him. It was armor so thick that even he had forgotten for a while that there was a soft boy in the center and that the armor wasn't who he was. It was how he hid who he was. In 2004, he created The X Factor, a show that built a vast empire. In 2007, he launched Britain's Got Talent, a year after the American version first aired in 2006. He signed Westlife, One Direction, Little Mix, Fifth Harmony, James Arthur, and Camila Cabello. He turned a third-place finish on The X Factor into one of the biggest boy bands in history. One Direction was his crowning achievement, a band assembled from 5 rejected boys who had been sent home and then brought together into a planet-wide force. They had been told no, handed a tragic verdict, then given a second chance by the man who had spent his career handing out verdicts. One of the biggest acts in music history was built out of exactly what Simon was known for: rejection. He took 5 rejected boys and made them the most loved band on earth. It's a deep irony. The man who built a career on rejection, who had once been rejected himself, built his greatest success by reversing his own cruelty. He looked at the rejected and showed them what they could become, turning a pile of no's into a generation-defining yes. Along the arc of his life, that's the moment the mask and the man almost met. The empire was built everywhere. Money accumulated, shows got bigger, records stacked up, and the man at the center worked harder and harder until the engine of his success began to swallow him. While the world saw the most confident man on television, he was quietly becoming one of the most exhausted on the planet. He worked like a vampire, he said later, staying up until 8 in the morning, working every day, including weekends and sleeping in the afternoon. He was so ferociously a workaholic that his body no longer felt like his own. He described that period as constant, relentless pressure, and admitted with brutal honesty that he reached a point where he didn't care if he lived or died. The man who had everything, more money than he could ever spend, and the most powerful job in entertainment, reached a point where he didn't care if he lived or died. All the wealth, fame, and empire could not fill the hole that had been there since his father taught him about the sign at 12. None of it made him feel important, because the one person he'd never learned to make feel important was himself. The loss that broke him most came early. His father, Eric, died in 1999. The cruelty of the timing was unbearable. On the night Westlife, one of his most important acts, reached #1, Simon got the call that his father had had a heart attack and died. Imagine the highest professional high of your life arriving on the same day you lose your father. Triumph and grief colliding in one moment, taking a phone call in the middle of a celebration, and walking out to find that the man who taught you your most important lesson was gone. Simon has said he would give up all his success just to have his father back, all the fortune, fame, and empire for one more moment with him. Because what he was really missing was not achievement, but the one person who had told him, without conditions, that he mattered. His mother, Julie, died in 2015. She had believed in him when nobody else did and been his biggest supporter when he struggled and floated and didn't know who he was. She taught him not to give up. Her death sent him into a spiral. The mask he had built his life around had become the only thing he was, and instead of facing the pain, he ran from it, straight into work. He became even more obsessive. The work became his anesthesia, the money his proof that he was alive. In the years after his parents died, he existed in the shadow of his grief. He has admitted to privately battling depression and anxiety, to nights when he didn't want to be alive. He kept it all hidden because the public had only ever wanted the tough man who couldn't be hurt. The man who had built a life on shouting, "Look at me, I'm untouchable." was quietly falling apart and hiding the collapse behind the very success that was making it worse. That's the tragedy. Not the failure, but the success itself being the cage. In 2010, he left American Idol at the height of its power, a decision that surprised the world and gave him a chance to build something of his own. But he would later call the business decisions that followed his greatest regret, most of all one about the greatest act he ever found. One Direction. He didn't own the name, a detail that never seemed like a problem while the band was together. When they split, he found that the name, the future, and the possibility of a reunion belonged to the band, not to him. He said repeatedly that his one regret was not owning the name of his greatest achievement. "I'll buy it back from you," he said, half laughing, half mourning, in an interview that went viral. Behind the joke was a man watching the greatest achievement of his life slip out of reach, the way other things had. The man who controlled the careers, verdicts, and destinies of thousands discovered he could not control the one thing he had built that he cared about most. The greatest thing he ever made didn't belong to him, a quiet sadness from a man who built an empire on ownership and control. Then came the moment that broke him in his own body. In August 2020, at his home in Malibu, Simon Cowell fell from an electric bicycle and broke his back in several places. He was rushed to the hospital and underwent overnight 6-hour emergency surgery to fuse his spine. He said the doctors worried the injury might be worse than they had thought and that it was the hardest physical thing he had ever been through. It was the wake-up call that finally broke his denial. Lying in a hospital bed with his spine held together by metal, he told the world what he had never dared say before. He had not been healthy. He had been eating badly and masking pain with stronger painkillers, walking through his own destruction. He said the accident made him finally understand he had been given a second chance. The recovery, the physical agony, and the slow work of learning to walk again forced him into a place he had spent his whole career avoiding. He had to stop, to feel, to go to therapy. It was there, face to face with everything he had been running from, that the toughest man on television had to learn, in his 60s, what most people learn in their 20s. How to feel, how to be alone without wanting to disappear, and how to let the people who love him. But the greatest change came from a boy, not from the pain. In 2014, at 54, Simon became a father. His son Eric was born on Valentine's Day, and it changed everything. Before Eric, he said, he was a workaholic existing only for work. After Eric, he learned what life was actually for. He stopped thinking about the next record and started thinking about being a dad. He says it himself in a way that makes a room cry. He finally knows what it is to feel truly, painfully happy. The man who said he didn't care if he lived or died now says he understands deeply what it is to have a reason to be alive. The physical change mirrored the inner one. He gave up sugar, processed food, and years of self-destruction, cut the drinking, said goodbye to painkillers, and took his own advice about health after a doctor's warning. The transformation everyone saw was real, but the one that mattered more didn't make headlines. The man who was terrified of being alone now spends his time with the people who matter. He finally spoke publicly about his stutter after hiding it for 60 years. Not because he was ashamed, but because he felt safe enough to let the world see the real him. He has spoken openly about his regret, grief, depression, the vampire years, and not wanting to live. The judge who built a career on hiding has become, at 60, one of the most honest voices in entertainment. The last years have brought a gentler, more honest Simon. He still works. The empire and the shows are still there, and a new act is coming to Netflix. But the work no longer runs him. He answers the phone for his son, sits on the living room floor and watches The Jungle Book, and does the unglamorous real work of a man who finally decided to let himself love and be loved. He says he's happier than he has ever been, not because of money or fame, but because the lesson his father taught him when he was 12 is finally being honored by the person who matters most, himself. Every tough person you've met, every coworker, every boss, every parent who told you you'd never be enough carries a wound they hide. Cruelty is almost always fear in disguise. The sign Simon's father told him about is written on every person you will ever meet, and the man who became famous for ignoring it had to learn, at his darkest point, that the sign was the whole secret. He built an empire on the opposite of his father's advice, and it nearly killed him. He came back by finally letting the softness in. He spent 60 years as the hardest man on television, and the moment he stopped was the first time he truly felt the sign. Make me feel important. The only person who can ever read it is the one in the mirror. Now he sits on the floor of a living room with his son, finally at peace. The toughest man on TV found the softest heart, hidden for 60 years. And the person he had to read the sign on, in the end, was the man in the mirror.